Literary Criticism. Chapter 1. Plato. Plato lived during the period 427 to 347 BC. Plato was an immensely influential ancient Greek philosopher, a student of Socrates, writer of philosophical dialogues, and founder of the academy in Athens where Aristotle studied. Plato lectured extensively at the academy and wrote on many philosophical issues dealing especially in politics, ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. Homer was a major influence on Plato. The most important writings of Plato are his dialogues, although some epistles or letters have come down to us under his name. The dialogues include Ion, Lysis, Gorgias, Symposium, Phaedrus, and Republic. Plato's theory of art and literature are mostly contained in Ion and Republic. Historical context. Plato lived in a time of political decline and dissolution. Education was in a sorry state. The epics of Homer were venerated by the Greeks at this time. However, philosophers criticized those passages in Homer which showed the gods in an unfavorable light. Courage, heroism, magnificence, etc. were virtues prized highly by the Greeks. The wonderful flowering time of Greek art and literature was over. Literature had become immoral, corrupt, and degenerate, and was the object of much hostile criticism. Philosophers and orators were regarded as leading spirits superior to poets and artists. Next comes basic critical precepts of Plato. The first one is poetic inspiration. The poet is divinely inspired like the prophets. Poetry is not a craft that can be learned and practiced at will. It is the result of divine inspiration. The implication here, which is later taken up by Plato, is that poetry is not rational and that the poets themselves do not often understand what they write in a moment of frenzy. Therefore, poetry cannot be relied upon as it is not the result of conscious, considered judgment. Further, poets may express divine truths, but such truths remain beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals. Second one is imitation or mimesis. Plato believed that ideas or heavenly archetypes alone are true and real. All earthly things are mere copies of them. In other words, beauty, goodness, justice, etc. are mere copies of the ideal beauty, goodness, etc., which exist in a heavenly realm. Plato regards mimesis or imitation as mere representation, not expression, which is creative. If ultimate reality consists of the ideas of things of which individual objects are but reflections or imitations, then the painter or poet who imitates those individual objects is imitating an imitation and so producing something which is still further removed from ultimate reality. For example, a chair exists firstly as idea, secondly as object of craftsmanship, and thirdly as object of representation in art. Thus, mimesis is thrice removed from reality in the Platonic conception of the world. Just as the painter only imitates what he sees and does not know how to make or to use what he sees, he could paint a bed but not make one, so the poet imitates reality without necessarily understanding it. The third one is the cave image. Here, the physical world is in the form of a cave in which the humans are trapped from the beginning of life, where we are stationary and cannot move our heads, so we perceive only shadows and sounds. Without reason, one of us is released and is encouraged to travel upward to the entrance of the cave. Then he is pulled to the entrance of the cave, where the light is hurting his eyes that are accustomed to the dark. The world of daylight represents the realm of ideas. His eyes grow accustomed to the light and he can look up to the sun and understand that the ultimate source of light, what the ultimate source of light and life is. This gradual process is a metaphor of education and enlightenment. The enlightened person now has a moral responsibility to the unfortunate people still in the cave to rescue them and bring them into the light. Plato's attack on poetry. Plato attacks poetry on four grounds: moral, intellectual, emotional, and utilitarian. The attack must be judged with reference to the socio political context and with Plato's dedication to restoring health in both the individual and the state. First one, moral. Poetry is not conducive to social morality because poets cater to the popular taste and narrate tales of man's vices. Poets lie about gods and represent them as corrupt, immoral, dishonest, and subject to the vices of humanity. Drama is even more harmful because judgment in dramatic matters is left to the many, and the result is lawlessness and license. The second one is intellectual. Poets have no knowledge of truth. Poets, like painters, imitate appearances and not the truth of things, illusions and not reality. Poetry is thrice removed from reality. The third one is emotional. The poet's inspiration is of a mysterious, irrational kind. Hence, his utterances are unreliable. Poetic truths, which are full of obscurities and contradictions, and which lack moral restraint, can be no substitute for knowledge based on reason. Except lyric poetry, which is narrative, all other kinds of poetry, epic, tragedy, and comedy, are imitative, which has pernicious effects. In imitative poetry, the poet and the reader identify themselves with the fictitious characters, which leads to the unhealthy weakening of character. It enfeebles the individual. Imitative poetry abounds in the vulgar, sensational, and corrupt because it is easier to imitate the baser part of the soul. According to Plato, the soul has three parts: rational, spirited, and desirous. Tragedy gives unrestrained expression to the emotions of pity and grief, thus urging the audience to keep reason at abeyance and play a woman's part. Fourth one is utilitarian. Poetry serves no useful purpose because the poet merely imitates the surface of things without knowing how to make use of them. According to Plato, there are three arts concerned with all things: use, the most noble; make, and then imitate, the basest. Plato's theory in a nutshell. Art is potentially dangerous for several reasons. Art is essentially deceptive. Art is mainly concerned with sensual pleasure. Art is psychologically destabilizing for the individual. Art leads to immorality. Art is politically dangerous, threat to the common good. Plato's achievements. Plato introduces the concept of mimesis as an essential characteristic of all art. He also divides arts into two: fine arts and useful arts. Useful arts mean medicine, agriculture, etc. Though Plato generally deals with poetry as a servile copy of superficial appearances, he was aware of the imitation of ideal forms of an unseen world beyond the senses. He associated this imitation with poetry of the highest kind. Thus, he hints of poetry being a creative process. Plato advances considerably in his theory of poetic inspiration and treats it as an ecstatic power which liberates the soul from the bondage of convention and carries man nearer to truth. Poetry is inspiration, but also an art, and Plato breaks new ground in laying down the basic principles for its practice as an art. The poet must take thought, select and organize his material, follow the laws of order and restraint, and conduct study and exercise. Plato emphasized for the first time that organic unity is essential for success in all arts. He compares a work of art to a living organism whose various organs work harmoniously together. Plato's classification of poetry into lyric, epic, and dramatic originated the classification of poetry based on forms and styles. He accepts pity and fear as emotions proper to tragedy and thus lays the foundation for catharsis. Regarding the function of poetry, he is of the view that it is not merely the giving of pleasure, but the molding of human character. Plato was the first to enunciate the classical ideals of artistic beauty in his description of the poetic ideals of austerity, order, and restraint. Plato was also the first to emphasize the value of decorum in art.